Today we're going to go over your information on the Civil War. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to look at a map of the Civil War. You can tell the Confederate states that are shaded here, the Union states, includes California, Oregon, Kansas, Missouri, Iowa, Minnesota, all the way to Maine, and the Confederate states from Texas to Virginia. So how many total Confederate states were there? There were 11 states that will secede from the Union, from the United States. There are 3 Confederate states that border Union states, and they are Arkansas, Tennessee, and Virginia. There are 3 Union states that will border Confederate states: West Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri. We discussed and read about the different types of economies. We talked about that the North was very heavily reliant upon an industrial economy, and the South had an agricultural economy. That's what that word agrarian means, is agriculture. They depended on harvesting crops. The biggest thing that we needed to know from this was the North's 3 goals to win the war. They were: the North wanted to block Southern ports to deprive the South of outside goods. Second, the Union wanted to control the Mississippi River to split the South and control the trade and travel of the body of water. And third, the North wanted to capture Richmond, Virginia, which was the capital of the Confederate States of America. We then drew this. Are the 3 Union goals. The first goal, again, the North wanted to block Southern ports. 2, to control the Mississippi River. And 3rd, to capture Richmond, Virginia. We then looked at some things that led up to the Civil War. The election of 1860. Lincoln is elected president, and this made the Southerners worry that he would do away with slaves. South Carolina secedes. It's the first state to secede or leave the United States. Georgia votes to secede, but the vote was close. Not all Georgians were in favor of seceding. The Confederate States of America. 7 states voted to join together to form a new country. Eventually, that becomes 11 states, so 4 more joined. The beginning of the war was at Fort Sumter. Troops from Confederate Augusta gathered ammunition to attack the Northern troops who were inside Fort Sumter. And the Union blockade. The Northern soldiers created blocks on goods at ports and railways so that they did not reach Southern or Confederate soldiers. Then, depending on what type of notes you did, you had slotted notes, or we did some notes with pictures. And so, here's the Fort Sumter notes. It said the Civil War began on April 12, 1861. Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, which was a Union fort in Charleston, South Carolina. Union forces were low on ammo and food and surrendered the next day. Nobody was killed except a horse. Remember? Alright, so the blockade. Here's a picture of the Anaconda Plan. Okay, the Anaconda Plan is where the North wanted to squeeze the South and not allow for it to trade with Europe. So they would block the Mississippi River. They would put up different ships in the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, so Union leaders blocked Southern ports. Union ships lined the coasts and would not let ships out to trade. In April 1862, Union soldiers landed at Tybee Island and captured Fort Pulaski, the fort that protected Savannah. Once the brick fort was obliterated, the North was able to blockade Savannah. After this time, hardly any Confederate ships could make it in or out. And here's some pictures of the Union blockade. So we will now talk about some battles of the war. The first battle that we're going to talk about is Antietam. Confederate General Robert E. Lee wanted to bring the war to the North. The Battle of Antietam took place in September of 1862 in Maryland. It was the bloodiest one-day battle of the Civil War. over 26,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or went missing that day. Compare the Union camp to the Confederate camp, and you can see even by this picture how more advanced the Union camp was from the Confederate camp. The battle ended in a draw. However, General Lee decided to withdraw from Maryland and return to Virginia. So Lincoln claimed this as a victory for the Union and gained much needed support from Northerners who had blamed the president for previous losses. One important thing about the Civil War was the Emancipation Proclamation. After the Battle of Antietam, President Lincoln issued a proclamation that freed all slaves in states fighting against the Union. Lincoln's proclamation shifted the focus of the Civil War. It was now a fight for freedom. But people in the South said that Lincoln's proclamation had no effect on them because technically they were not part of the United States anymore. The order promised that the Union military would enforce the proclamation, and it invited former slaves to join the Union Army. Many African Americans enlisted and fought bravely, aware that they were fighting for the freedom of their people. Another important battle was a 3-day battle, Gettysburg. The Battle of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 1863, was the turning point of the war. Confederate forces under Lee once again tried to invade the North, but they were stopped. The larger Union Army overwhelmed Lee's troops and won the battle. The Union victory left the South with no chance of winning the war. So that was the most important part about Gettysburg. Both sides experienced major losses of life. More than 51,000 soldiers died on the battlefield. Due to the loss of a large portion of Lee's men, the South never invaded the North again. So after this battle, the North began to put constant pressure on the South and was eventually able to invade and capture the southern states. Afterwards, Lincoln made a speech at a ceremony dedicating the site as a cemetery. This Gettysburg Address, as it was called, lasted 3 minutes, but is regarded as one of the most inspiring speeches in American history. In the speech, Lincoln said that the Civil War was to preserve government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Chickamauga, Georgia, was free from major battles during the first few years of the war, but in 1863, close to 58,000 Union troops moved into northwest Georgia, where they battled the Confederate Army. The battle resulted in both sides losing over 16,000 men and forced the Union Army to retreat back to Tennessee. So it was actually a victory for the Confederacy. The next thing in Georgia was the Atlanta campaign. We're introduced now to General Sherman. He is the Union general who will devastate Georgia. In 1864, General Sherman moved his Union Army south from Tennessee to Atlanta. They fought Confederate soldiers along the way, leaving a path of destruction and chaos. On September 2nd, 1864, Sherman's troops captured Atlanta and set the city on fire. It was important for them to destroy the railroads of Georgia, to cripple the economy of Georgia. The next thing was the March to the Sea. In November 1864, Sherman began his march through Georgia from Atlanta to Savannah. His troops destroyed many towns and plantations along the way. Sherman's march to the sea cut Confederate supply lines and crushed the spirit of the Confederate Army. They captured Savannah on December 21st, 1864, and Sherman gave the city of Savannah to Abraham Lincoln as a Christmas gift. All of these towns, from Atlanta to Savannah, most of them were destroyed. Places like Covington, Eatonton, Milledgeville, Sandersville, Louisville, the former capital, Waynesboro, Millen, Statesboro, all the way down to Savannah. Sherman's men would destroy Georgia's railroads, would heat them up and tie them around trees so that they could never be used again. One of the most notorious sites of the Civil War was the Confederate prison camp in Andersonville, Georgia. The prison was overcrowded and unsanitary, and over 13,000 of the 45,000 captives died of disease and starvation. In early April 1865, Union troops finally reached Richmond, Virginia, and took the capital of the Confederacy, Richmond. On April 9, 1865, General Lee surrendered to General Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, and the Civil War was over. But instead of celebrating, soldiers on both sides went home quietly. Just a few days later, on April 14, 1865, Abraham Lincoln will be assassinated. And lastly, the war's effects. The Civil War had major effects on the United States. These effects were mostly positive in the northern and western parts of the country, but in the South they were disastrous. The war had been fought mostly on southern soil. Many homes, cities, railroads, farms, etc. had been destroyed and had to be rebuilt after the war. But the southern states had little money to do so, and it took years, decades even, to rebuild. They were financially bankrupt and could not pay their war debts. Alright, so your Civil War questions, your study guide for this part. Which side believed that the states should have more power than the national government? That again, of course, was the Confederacy. They believed in states' rights. 2. Why was the Union's blockade called the Anaconda Plan? So that the Union could squeeze the South. Union ships lined the coast and would not let ships in or out to trade. 3. What was the bloodiest one-day battle of the Civil War? Antietam. Number 4. What did Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation do? In theory, it freed the slaves in the South. But technically, the South was its own country. It did not have to follow Lincoln's proclamation. 5. Which battle was considered a major turning point in the war for the North? Gettysburg, because the South never invaded the North again. 6. What was the first Civil War battle on Georgia soil? That was at Chickamauga. 7. What did Union General Sherman do in Georgia? He invaded Atlanta and burned it to the ground. He then did his march to the sea, where he burned and destroyed crops and homes throughout Georgia on his way to Savannah. And then he gave Savannah as a Christmas gift to Lincoln. 8. What was the Atlanta campaign, where Atlanta was invaded and burned? 9. Sherman's troops marched from Atlanta to Savannah, leaving a path of destruction along the way. That was called the March to the Sea. 10. Which prison camp had the highest death rate of any Civil War prison? That is Andersonville. And 11. Describe the war's effects on the South. They were devastating. Many homes, cities, railroads, farms, etc. had been destroyed and had to be rebuilt after the war. And that is our Civil War unit.